G'day everyone and welcome back to the Big Bros podcast. My name is Jeremy and welcome if it's your first time joining us on the show. Episode 81 today and I'm joined by my lovely friend and co-host Ilan. How's it going, mate?
Pretty good, Jeremy. Tell us about your Saturday.
My Saturday? Oh, gee. Well, yeah, it was a lovely weekend witnessing two good football sides play in a preliminary finals. So, it was nice for a change. My dad and I had the absolute privilege of being in a nice little corporate area, which was an absolute first for the both of us. So we heavily enjoyed that, and it was some lovely father-son bonding time together. It was nice to enjoy a few beers together after the match, wasn't it, mate?
It was great fun, especially when we saw Brad Johnson.
That's it.
And I went up to him and I said, "Love your work, Brad," until you mentioned to me that no one has ever probably called him Brad in his life.
Yeah, absolutely bradded Jono. So that was funny to see. But yeah, what a lovely man he was. So shout out to Jono.
Shout out to Jono. Jeremy, what are we chatting about today?
Today we are talking, it's a bit of a deeper topic today, I would say. I mean, last few weeks have been a bit more lighthearted, a bit more relationship focused and a bit more human behavior focused. Whereas today we wanted to dive into something a little bit more vulnerable, a little bit deeper, and that being our trauma, traumas that we feel, traumas that we go through as people, as humans in our mid-20s and younger, and why it's important to not let your traumas get the better of you. Because after all, we all experience shit in life, and I don't think I've ever come across someone that has no baggage, trauma, downfalls, challenges attached to them. Everyone has gone through stuff, and it's just about working out how to respond to your traumas, and the way in which you respond will really dictate who you are as a person and how people will perceive you as well.
Yeah, and granted, everyone's going to have different traumas. For some, it's going to be completely debilitating, and it's trauma that might require a lot of deep work and self-work and going to a therapist, and that's okay. And I think more specifically what you and I want to touch on today's episode is the idea that your trauma should never ever be an excuse for bad behavior and chronic bad decisions. And what I mean by that is a lot of times people will make, they'll use their trauma response and they'll say, well, that's just who I am as a person. They'll betray someone because they'll say, well, I've got fear of abandonment, so that's why I betrayed you first, so you couldn't betray me as the first person. And I think oftentimes it's now become a little bit of a trend, at least in my opinion, that a lot of people say they've got traumas and they'll justify that as they'll justify their bad behaviors with whatever traumatic stuff they have gone through. And my personal opinion on that is that with trauma, I think if you're using it as an excuse to justify bad behavior, it's almost insulting to those who have gone through really complex trauma, have done the self-work, and try to do better every day. Because you're essentially telling that person, hey, I haven't done the work like you have, so I'm just going to use the excuse of my trauma as a way of kind of neglecting and deflecting, any sort of responsibility on my end.
You mentioned trend there, and I think trend is actually right to say because we see so many people making jokes out of it on social media, on TikTok. It's like, screw all men and screw them, and I can get away with doing whatever to them because all men are bad and they've all treated me bad in the past, so therefore I'm going to get away with whatever I want because I've been treated bad in the past. And I think a lot of that gets a bit glorified, and a lot of it gets not accolades, that's the wrong word, but it gets recognition.
It's glorified.
Yeah, it gets recognition and praise that it absolutely does not deserve in the slightest, because it goes back to what you get taught as a kid. And what is that we all get taught as a kid is that two wrongs don't make a right. Just because you've experienced something bad in the past, the best way to go about, acting upon what you've experienced that is bad is hitting it with a good response and a positive response. And that's not easy to do. That's hard to do. But, things that are hard because, not everyone is doing them. People take the easy road out, and that easy road is maybe just feeling that trauma and woe is me mentality, and just responding to situations in that same way and not breaking that cycle. But if you're able to break that cycle, albeit a hard one to break for some people, and I understand that, all trauma is different and one story is not the same as another, and everyone experiences it to a different extent, but by breaking that cycle, you will only come out of it a bigger person. And I think we need to stop that trend of glorifying the shitness that happens to people and getting away with continuing that and acting that way towards other people.
I completely agree. And I don't want to, come across in this podcast as though me and you, and we're not doing this, but I don't want to give off the impression that you and I are invalidating someone's experience. Your trauma is your trauma.
For sure.
The way it impacted you is unique to you. And there's no one telling you that it's not a big deal. It is a big deal, and it hurts, and it does, and it affects who you are. It affects your decisions. I'm not denying that. The cool thing, though, is that was written in the past, and we actually can't control the past, but we can control the future. And the great thing is we have a conscious decision to be made. And the thing with trauma work, and, there's a lot of complexity with trauma work. It's uncomfortable, but it's very useful. And it's very useful because it allows you to actually grow and allows you to reframe the event that caused you so much pain and anguish. And I don't know if you've ever, Gabor Mate?
I don't.
So he's, I think he was a medical doctor by trade, but he does a lot of work on kind of anxiety and childhood trauma. And he compares trauma almost to that of a physical wound. So he says that one aspect of trauma is that if it stays open, like a physical wound, let's say I scratched your back or you cut yourself, there's an open wound. If you tap on it, it would be sore because the wound is open, right? You haven't put antiseptic on it. You haven't done anything. It's going to be sore because the nerve endings are really close to the surface of the skin. And the thing with that is it serves almost like a reminder that the same pain is almost like a physical tap on that chest. So any emotional trigger that brings you back to a certain moment in time, it's going to serve the same reminder as if you had that scratch on your back. But the thing is, with time, he also says that it also develops a scar, right? It's going to heal. You're going to become so sensitized to the trauma as well. So, for example, if you do have that open wound and it heals up, you're going to have a lasting memory of it because there's going to be, maybe there's stitches there. Maybe it's a scab. But if I touch it, it's not going to be as sore. So the way he pretty much explains it is that with trauma, you can become desensitized to it through, repeated exposure, right? And that can be really uncomfortable for people to hear because it's essentially telling them, they have to kind of readdress, expose themselves to the same traumatic feelings and same traumatic events. Like people who go through PTSD, they'll avoid certain places and situations. For example, the smell, the air, the people around, that's just so much. But the thing is, with time, you can almost become desensitized to it in the same way that if you had a scab or a scar, it would become desensitized to you kind of tapping on it. I think that's a useful way of thinking about trauma.
Yeah, I think it is useful because it's about your perspective. Like you said, you've got a scar there, you've got a scab there, and that's always going to serve as a reminder. And that reminder is debilitating for a lot of people. So, we recognize that it is debilitating for a lot of people. But imagine if you could look at that scar, look at that scab and use that as some motivation for the future in terms of how you want to be as a person. It's like that example of living with a heavy smoker or a heavy alcoholic as a parent, for example. If you've come from a family where one of your parental figures has, heavily smoked their whole life, heavily drunk alcohol their whole life, and, that's trauma for you. Seeing that and growing up in that has been a traumatic experience for you. Disclaimers if this is, apparent to anyone listening as well, but imagine if you were able to see that situation and use that as motivation for you to actually not indulge in those activities in the future because you've seen how bad it can be, rather than actually seeing that and thinking, okay, well, woe is me, this was my upbringing and this is what I had to experience, so I'm just going to go down that road because it's clearly embedded within, my upbringing and my genetics and my physical environment. Imagine if you could use it to the opposite and say, because I experienced this, I want to make a better life for myself and not experience that. And therefore, when it comes to me having kids in the future and being a parent, I want to make sure that because I experienced something bad to that extent, I want to make sure that it doesn't happen again. It's like that never again type of mentality. I'm going to make an even better life because of the shit that I experienced.
Well, it's that exact anecdote, which is you've got two identical twins who grew up with an alcoholic father, who had abusive relationships, who wasn't a good dad, who wasn't a good parental figure. One of those identical twins moves out, they begin drinking every day. They have abusive relationships and copy the same habits of their dad. Then someone asks him, why do you drink? And they say, well, because my dad was an alcoholic. Now, there's another identical twin, the brother, moves out, doesn't ever drink alcohol, has a successful business, has a good family, doesn't, maintains relationships and healthy relationships. And someone asks him, why don't you drink alcohol? And he responds, because my dad was an alcoholic. It's pretty much speaking to the exact point you just said there. But what it does speak to as well is that conscious decision, because the thing with trauma is you can transform it for good. It can serve as such a useful reminder, especially for people. The way I think about it as well is kids who have grown up with really poor parental roles. I look at that almost as a great, almost blueprint of how not to be a bad parent, or rather how to avoid being a bad parent, because you've got all the actions and behaviors, and you could logically say, okay, well, my mum and dad did this, and I was a bit fucked up as a consequence of it. But it gives you a roadmap, because you can look at the exact opposite of what they could have done, and that's your instruction on how to actually be a good parent, at least in your eyes. And I think that's the role that trauma can be. And I think another useful way of looking at trauma is looking at it as a bunch of chapters in your life, as a bunch of stories, because a lot of people will internalize trauma as who they are. The trauma that happened to me, it's who I am on the inside. Because the thing with trauma, it's not necessarily what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a product of that trauma.
It's a nice point, because I think it goes back to that woe is me mentality when, a lot of people unfortunately experience trauma, and it can be multiple forms of trauma as well, and think, well, is this just who I am? Is this just really who I am? I'm just a magnet towards this trauma. And look, some people get a shocking run of bad luck. They really, really do. They really, really do. And, we're coming from a place of recognition and privilege here where, our position is probably a lot more favorable than that of others. But then again, everything is relevant, and there's a lot of context to certain scenarios as well. But when you are so embedded in a lot of trauma, it is sometimes hard to see that light at the end of the tunnel. And it's really easy to get stuck into that loophole of bad thinking, negative thinking, because that's what you've grown up with seeing and experiencing. And it's like that provides comfort to you. It's like that is that comforting thing to you. And it's that same example of that, that girl that goes running back to the ex-boyfriend that was, maybe abusive towards them, or is stuck in that relationship that is an abusive and toxic relationship, is because that provides a sense of comfort, albeit horrible comfort. It is comfortable to them. So getting out of that, it makes sense why people really struggle to escape that, because that is all they have known. You know what I mean? And it's a really weird human concept, but it makes sense. And it's almost as like if someone was to then come along to their life and be that figure of, I'm going to actually treat you good and provide you with an incredible life and show you love and show you care. Sometimes that can get rejected because it just seems so uncomfortable, and it makes sense why people feel that way. But it also, it's also upsetting as well to see that, because all you want is for someone to experience love after experiencing such trauma, and it's hard to snap out of that mentality. So yeah, what do you reckon, and how in which do you reckon people can go from, experiencing that toxicity that feels comfortable to them to then actually appreciating that love and positivity that might feel uncomfortable and completely different to them?
Well, I think you spoke a really interesting point there, which is there's an element of uncomfortable comfort there. It's oxymoronic, but I think it starts with actually understanding one's trauma response. So I'll give you an example. If someone is really, really hyper independent, where they, in their adult life, they never ever want to rely upon anyone else because they've been let down in the past, right? They may have been abandoned. They may have relied on too many people when they were younger and they were disappointed. And the trauma response overcorrects for that. It overcorrects to the extent that this person now will never ask for help. Even if they're drowning, even if their mental health is at an all-time low and they are really, really struggling, they will still take it upon themselves to be the control freak, to do everything themselves. That's an overcorrection, and that's what oftentimes trauma responses are. Another example, if you've been cheated on in a past relationship, a trauma response for you might be to be consistently suspicious, to consistently want to check your partner's phone, to completely overanalyze everything that they do. Because the thing with trauma responses is it's adaptive until it becomes maladaptive. And what I mean by that is the useful thing about trauma is it essentially tells you, we had this really negative experience. We don't want you to experience this again in the future because this threatens your survival and your well-being. So what we're going to do is give you so many red flags to look out for to the point that you overcorrect for any, neutral stimuli. So the idea being here is if you find that you're with someone and you find that you never want to ask them for help because you've been hyper independent, even though they'd be more than happy to help you and they won't let you down, that is going to be an overcorrection. So your question is, how can someone kind of get past that? It's by understanding it's writing down what behaviors they do to overcorrect for things. Because the thing is, I think to a certain degree, we all kind of grow up naive. And I think I was quite naive until, I was 18 or 19, and that's when I was burnt for the first time within that relationship context. But that taught me so much. And I overcorrected a little bit. I think I became quite insecure, quite cynical of the world around me, and I think I overcorrected it. But that's trauma for you. It'll make you overcorrect for things that aren't that threatening because you don't want to experience the same pain you did. So by actually writing down what behaviors you engage in and saying, is this an overcorrection, or is this an undercorrection, or is this a reasonable response, is a very kind of good metacognitive exercise to do because you're zooming out from the situation. You're allowing yourself to actually think about your behaviors, because I think oftentimes if it's very easy to say, well, I'm the way I reacted like that because of my trauma. I'm not going to take accountability. But if you're blowing up your girlfriend's phone or your boyfriend's phone saying like, where are you? Why aren't you home yet? Are you cheating on me? Like, if you can zoom out from that situation and ask yourself, is the reason that I'm blowing up my partner's phone is because it's an overcorrection because I've been so burntly past, that's a really, really good start. I also would really recommend, if you've gone through really complex trauma, go to a therapist. And I'm not just saying this because, I'm training to become a therapist. I'm saying this because therapists have a unique way of being able to get you to reframe the experiences you had in a very safe environment where there's no judgment. And there's this therapy known as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, otherwise known as EMDR, which is almost a kind of therapy that puts you in a hypnotic state. But the thing with trauma is you want to reframe the memory, right? In whatever way you can. And that is something that is quite expensive, but hopefully, it's accessible. It'll be more accessible to a lot of people in the future. But that is a really, really promising area of intervention for people who have really debilitating trauma. But before you even do that, just identify what your overcorrections are.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're pretty vulnerable there because you experienced it for yourself. You just mentioned, you felt like you came out of that traumatic relationship. It provided a sense of trauma to you, and you had these, insecure tendencies, and you felt like, that was your response to the trauma, and naturally so. And this is why I think so many people listening would be able to resonate and relate to this because, we've all been in, whether it's relationships, friendships, whether it's, parental or not, we've all been in relationships of some sort that have maybe provided a sense of trauma to us, or we've gone through, grief and loss that's given us trauma, or sickness, whatever it might be. But we then come out of it feeling, maybe adverse and feeling like, whether it's insecure or unloved or unwanted or unworthy, so normal and so natural to feel that way, which you mentioned that you just felt like that as well. how long did you feel that way for? And you mentioned a tip in which to get over it, which was write things down and, do a bit of reflective practice. Is that what you did? Because if we're talking to someone that, is going through that right now and they're listening to this, it sounds easier said than done, doesn't it? So what do you reckon was the best way forward? What is the starting point?
It's a great question. I think literally looking back at hyper analyzing every behavior you do can have its negatives, but it can also have its positives. So, the one thing I did say, whilst I was insecure, I didn't ever let that insecurity stop me from entering a new relationship. I told myself that as long as I'm insecure, I'm not going to burden any partner with this. This is my problem to solve and my problem solely. And I think what kind of got me to get over it almost was the fact that I almost trivialized it. And I'm not saying this is a healthy thing to do, but I think to a certain degree, I told myself, everyone gets fucked over in a relationship at some point. I'm not that special, which in a way for a lot of people might sound invalidating. For me, it didn't sound invalidating. For me, it was, okay, great. Like, you've gone through what so many people have gone through. There's nothing unique about it. And guess what? People tend to get over this, meaning you're likely to get over it as well. I think for me at the time, I was just a very cynical person of, for example, women at the time. Because if you get burnt once, you have a very all or nothing mentality. Meaning if one person fucks you over, that means everyone else is going to fuck you over. So it took me a while to probably about a year to be like, okay, well, not everyone's like this. So I probably shouldn't treat everyone with that same view and paint that exact same brush across, the entire female population. And that, to be honest, that came with having really helpful friends. Because whilst my friends were compassionate through the shit I went through, they weren't enablers of bad behaviors. And I think that's a really useful tip for anyone who's got friends who are navigating trauma. Be a compassionate person, help them through it, be supportive, but don't enable their bad behavior. And my friends, I never had terrible or bad behavior, but if I didn't have good friends, I'm worried to think what kind of road I could have gone down in terms of my worldview. Because my friends were good at keeping me accountable. And that's what good friends do. They keep you accountable. They're compassionate, but they don't enable. But again, I think just hyper analyzing the little things that I would, think of, I would ask myself, is this really a reasonable response? And more times than not, I was able to do that kind of self-awareness. But I think that's just me. And I don't know.
No, that's great. I think that point about your friendships is key. And gee, we're lucky to, have that around us. And, but even if you've got like a couple people that you can rely on and speak expressively about these experiences too, what a difference it makes. Because like you said, when you're going through that and you become quite cynical of whether it is guys, whether it is girls, and it links back to my first point as well about, what we're seeing on the internet is, if a guy has mistreated a girl, then that girl takes the opinion of, well, all men are bad type of thing. And, you see the comments blowing up of like, yeah, you go girl, like all men bad, all this toxicity. And it's like,
you go girl.
It's like, I understand where they're coming from because, you've been there and you've experienced that yourself where, you took that viewpoint at one stage too. And I get it. I get that's why it makes sense why people take that viewpoint after experiencing such trauma, whether it's, they've been cheated on, whether they've been burnt. Like, it makes sense why they take that mentality.
But in fairness, like, you've been burnt before as well. You may have just been burnt differently. You may have not been in a relationship context. Everyone goes through trauma. Yeah. And that's the point I wanted to really drill home as well, is that I think you asked me before what actually helped me. And I just thought about it now. I think the clearest thing that helped me was I repulsed, and I still repulse the idea of having a victim mentality. I hate it. I don't know why I'm so disgusted by the victim mindset. For me, it's just the most disempowering thing to have. And I think the thing that got me out of that traumatic state or being able to kind of grow from it was being so repulsed by becoming a victim. I don't like that idea. Right? You can be victimized by something, and that could be out of your control, like many traumas are. But you don't have to remain a victim. But I think that's the most crucial thing, because the thing is, when you're a victim, you will self-sabotage. You will deliberately place yourself in situations where you screw others over, but you'll also screw yourself over. And I think with being, I think it's also big weakness as well. Like, it's not even vulnerable when you're in that victim mindset, because you're essentially telling other people, I don't want to go through the discomfort of learning about myself into tapping into an area where I can grow and evolve. You're literally telling other people, I want to remain in the same situation I am because the alternative is too uncomfortable. I don't know why, Jeremy, but that idea repulses me. And I think that was probably my biggest driving force.
I think that has to be the driving force. I think you're right. It's completely disempowering. It's basically you digging a big hole deep into the ground and jumping in it and saying, I'm stuck here. It is not my fault. I can't get out. Woe is me. That is what you're doing. You're digging that big hole and jumping in and just sitting in there and sitting in that despair. Completely disempowering. And no one is going to want to help you out of that if you put yourself in that position. And that's why when it comes to, coming out of a traumatic experience and wanting to, find love again, find friends again, whatever it might be, it's on you at the end of the day. You need to be the one to actually actualize that and make that happen for you. Because, if you find yourself meeting someone that, takes a fancy to you and wants to get to know you, but you keep bringing up your trauma without a game plan to get through it. Like if you just provide trauma to someone and talk about trauma to someone, but you constantly reiterate that woe is me mentality, that victim mentality, that, everyone must feel sorry for me. What a disempowering experience. What a way to just push someone good away from you as well. But if you take the mentality of like, yeah, I've gone through fucking shit, absolute shit, and this is what happened and it was absolutely terrible, but I'm still working through it, and I'm not maybe where I want to be yet, and I'm still in the pits a little bit, but this is kind of what I'm doing to put one foot in front of the other and make myself better. Wow, what a way to become attractive in that scenario. What a way to show that person that, well, here is someone in front of me that I've met that, has gone through shit, but isn't taking that complete victim mentality, is providing a bit of a roadmap forward for themselves, albeit even if it's just small. What an attractive quality.
And a lot of psychologists will actually mention the fact that once you establish a roadmap out of trauma, the stimuli that reminds you of that original trauma tends to dissipate. Because what trauma usually is a reminder to you that you still haven't accepted and almost physiologically accepted and come to terms with what happened to you. Because the intensity at which what happened was so overwhelming, it was so complex. So the way out of trauma shouldn't necessarily be quick, and it shouldn't be easy. It's going to be quite difficult, especially if you've gone through something really, really tough. And I think this is where I want to keep emphasizing this point. If you're struggling with trauma, please go reach out to someone, reach out to a therapist, because there is no shame, absolutely zero shame in wanting to better yourself and come to terms and accept kind of your past, because you are going to be a product of your past. But, you can also be a product of your present currently. So whatever decision you choose to make now will ultimately have an lasting impact on you in the future. And I will never, ever, obviously it's in my career that I would never shame anyone for coming in, but I don't want anyone ever to feel shame that they have the trauma. I want them to feel as though they're comfortable enough that they can reach out to someone, to book an appointment and take the time at their own pace to work on it, because in my opinion that's the most attractive thing.
Or even if it's just with a friend, I mean, a therapist, absolutely, but if you've got that someone in your life, just one person even that you feel comfortable to talk to and say, this is what I'm feeling at the moment, and going about it in a very gentle way as well. Because if you're just completely dumping on someone without a sense of compassion for what you're saying to that person as well, then that can get a bit tricky for that person.
That's why you go to a therapist. If you feel like you're going to dump and you can't control yourself, recommend going to a therapist. But as you said, if you can almost manage and control what you're going to say, talk to a friend.
Yeah, but dumping is good to an extent. I mean, we all need to get a rant off our chest at some stage and just dump to someone and say, far out, like, this is what I'm going to have a listen. I think it's when it becomes a repeat process without a way forward. And that way forward doesn't need to be this big grand plan, but, just basic steps. The fact that you might just be getting out of bed at a normal time for you rather than staying in bed all day, by picking up the phone and talking to that person, by eating your meals during the day. Just really, really small steps forward can have monumental steps when you accumulate those over time. So yeah, talking to a friend about it, albeit with compassion and care, can be absolutely pivotal as well. And I think, yeah, just your point as well about, just not disempowering yourself, because it's very easy to feel like the world is disempowering you, and then to actually reaffirm that to yourself and say, yeah, well, this is what's happening to me based on what the world is dishing out to me. So that's just the cards that I've been dealt. And, continuing to reaffirm yourself with that is just a completely, like you said, disempowering mentality. So if you can just recognize that, yeah, these cards that you've been dealt with have been absolutely shit, but what a blessing in a way to use it to your advantage, to try see what type of a person you are, to get yourself out of that and make something better for yourself. One of the best human challenges you could possibly be faced with, I reckon.
Well, it's the hero's arc, isn't it? Batman's parents were killed when he was younger, I think.
Don't remember. I'm not a big...
But it's the hero's arc, right? No hero has an easy childhood. No hero has an easy rise to the top. It's because they overcame their trauma. It's not because they used their trauma as an excuse for bad behaviors. And I think that's the key thing. If there's anything you can take out of this episode, it's the understanding that, yes, your trauma is unique to you. It was painful. It destroyed you in a lot of ways, and it took a toll on you. But you have the decision to make whether you want to use it as a justification for all your future behaviors, or whether you want to try to at least give it an effort to try and process it in a healthy human way so that you can live a better life as a consequence.
Absolutely. On that note, guys, happy Tuesday. Have a good week. If you have enjoyed this episode, let us know. Flick us a rating on Spotify. We would absolutely appreciate it and love to hear from you as well. And, as we always say, our DMs are always open if you do want to reach out to us and share your thoughts, feelings, opinions with us. We're all ears. So on that note, guys, happy Tuesday. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.